everyone and welcome to a rear delt masterclass. My name is Ben, and if you're new to this channel, I teach people about biomechanics and really more specifically anatomy and how you can apply that knowledge to better understand lifting and to improve your strength and your muscle size results in the gym. So this is a rear delt masterclass, as is obvious here. The rear delt on the left here is already winking at us. So without further ado, let's begin and jump right into it. So I wanted to start off with just a little bit of discussion around what the rear delt actually is and what it looks like, because I think a lot of people actually don't exactly know what it looks like on the body. I'm going to show several examples here. So on the left, again, winking is our rear delt. It basically runs from here all the way down to here, which we'll dive into in a little bit when we talk about the basic anatomy and stuff. But I want to show some physical representations because different people look differently just in terms of their individual anatomy, the shapes of their muscle bellies, the length of their tendons, their insertions, and how they may actually differ from person to person. But point being, this dude in this position has a rear delt that is kind of looks like this, right? So it's like, you don't see it kind of scraping all the way back here, but if we look at, say, the next person in a different position, because muscles look different in different positions, this being the rear delt right here, kind of underneath of this bulk right here, which is kind of more the middle delt. The rear delt here is kind of this sweeping sort of underneath, right? So the entire deltoid fans from all the way here, all the way around, right? So this is the kind of the front delt bulk, here's the middle delt bulk, and here's the rear delt bulk. This is the bulk that will make your shoulder look round from the side and from the back. And so in the image of this woman here who's doing up her ponytail, right, you can see that sort of roundness there on the back as well. If we look at more extreme examples like the Mr. Olympias of the world, right, this rear delt just kind of looks like just a big massive bulk. It almost looks like another freaking portion of the traps just kind of extended onto the arm. If we look at someone like Kai Green, who has one of the best backs of all time, in my opinion, you look at his rear delts, it basically looks like, again, it's just another trap, and it almost looks like it kind of just mushes in with all of his triceps. If you look at someone like Chris Bumstead, which who doesn't love a naked Chris Bumstead, right, you can see how in comparison to those first couple people we were looking at, where you see the size differences and almost how it looks like the rear delt kind of grows a little bit extra, almost to this weird little portion down here. So point just being, there are individual differences in anatomy and the way that your rear delt looks, depending on the size, the shape of you, your individual anatomy, in the position that you're in, it may look different. But the point is just generally speaking that this is a muscle that's going to add a lot of size to the back of your shoulder, which in most people's opinion is probably pretty important for looking jacked. So before we dive into the anatomy, like the origins and insertions and the functions and stuff, I just want to briefly talk about the nerve-related stuff because I think it's kind of cool. So this is the brachial plexus. It's a huge, basically collection or network of nerves that spans out from the bottom of your cervical spine. So this right here is your cervical spine, and here is the bottom. C5, 6, and 7 is what it's called down here, and it branches out. And the brachial plexus kind of converges into this other nerve called the axillary nerve. And so this is a bunch of mumbo jumbo over here. I'm gonna simplify it and get you to focus on just these two things right here. The anterior division of the axillary nerve and the posterior division. And the one that innervates the rear delt, which is to say the one that allows the rear delt to actually contract and activate via the brain and spinal cord, is this posterior division of the axillary nerve, the one in red, right? Because its branch, if you can see, follow that line, it kind of goes into the back side of the shoulder, right? It also will innervate the teres minor as well. Basically just the muscles on the back side of the shoulder, you can think about it as. And while this anterior division here, right, if you can follow this in, it actually innervates the rest of the deltoid. So the middle and the front delt is actually innervated by this anterior portion of this nerve, which is to say the nerve on the front side. Anterior is just jargon for front. And then the posterior division, which is to say the back side, posterior jargon for back. The posterior division is the one that innervates the rear delt. And this is important to know because it's important to understand why we can actually activate muscles differently. Other than just the intuitive, like front delt pulls forward, rear delt pulls backward thing, right? This is why we're actually even able to do that in the first place. So super, super important to understand. Now, when it comes to the actual anatomy, the biggest mistake that people are going to make is just looking at a photo like this. They're just going to look at an image that is from one perspective. And when we look at anatomy, anatomy is occurring in 3 dimensions. 4 if you want to count time. Haha, those of you physics nerds. But when we're talking about a 3-dimensional creature, we need to analyze anatomy in 3 dimensions. And so when we look at anatomy, we need to look at it from multiple angles. When we think about the rear delt in terms of how I will define the rear delt, we have kind of two major sections, but just first speaking, we need to identify just basic origins and insertions, okay? So this is the whole rear delt again, and it's gonna originate on the scapular spine, which is basically this big sort of bony ridge right here that I'm hovering my mouse over. And it will run down to the side and attach to what is known as the deltoid tuberosity. We're gonna talk about the nuance to that in just a second, but you can see from this angle how it looks a little bit different, right? You can kind of see the side aspect of it. So we have this whole scapular spinal part, and then it branches onto what is known as the acromion. The acromion is basically this flat shape right here. If you can see this line, a lot of people think this whole thing is the middle delt. Some people will agree or disagree with this, but as you're gonna see in just a second, the rear delt kind of bridges onto a little bit of that. So the rear delt is not just this thing that runs right here, it also kind of slips and slides around the side and adds roundness to what people think is the middle delt, but what kind of sort of really isn't. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of how we can actually sensibly make this more concrete? Well, when we think about the anatomy, I like to subdivide the rear delt into two portions. And here's portion number one, which is what we're gonna call in the rest of this video the more horizontal portion. Why? Well, because it's more horizontal compared to the second portion, which is more vertical. Okay, so you have one in blue, two in green. One I'm going to call the more horizontal thing, and the other I'm going to call the more vertical thing. I may also refer to it, just in casually speaking, as the back side of the rear delt and the front side of the rear delt. I think that's probably the one that I'll probably stick with the most, is back side referring to this number one, front side referring to this number two. Even though it's not on the front, I think you get what I mean. It is more on the front, it's kind of on the side. Okay, cool. So what does this really mean in terms of training? Well, it means that we want to pick a little bit of a variety of different exercises and angles and force directions to train the entirety of the rear delt. For some of you, this may be not super necessary just based on how well developed or not your rear delt is. But for me personally, I've had, or I've observed a huge benefit in being really specific to each of these portions. Now, the last thing that I want to go over in terms of the insertions that I mentioned earlier, before we get to the functional anatomy stuff with my dear friend Frank back there, is this perspective. So here's the source in the corner there. I want you all to just kind of ignore this image on the top right here, and we're just gonna focus on these two, okay? So this is a top-down view. Imagine you're looking at someone's right shoulder. This is their collarbone or their clavicle, so this is the front delt right here. The front delt is abbreviated as A1, A2, and A3. The middle delt is abbreviated as M1, and then the rear delt is abbreviated as P1, P2, and P3. I am someone who kind of just lumps P1, 2, and 3 into those two portions that I just mentioned, the back half and then the front half. This is based on a research article that basically subdivides the deltoid into 7 different portions. Some use 9, depending on who you ask. Let's just really, really simplify it and say, okay, here's the freaking rear delt, and here's the freaking back portion, and here's the freaking front portion. How about that? And both of these portions that I'm calling going to be the sort of the back half and the front half, they attach to this bony landmark right here. So you see a lot of people will make the mistake of assuming that the attachment site of all the deltoids is just one single spot. And this is, I think, intuitive on some level. Each of these little green slips here represent where the front delt attaches, as in A1, where the middle delt attaches, as in M1, and then the P1 is where the rear delt attaches. So the rear delt attaches a little bit more on the back side of the arm, and that's going to be important to understand when we're talking about just actually aligning things up to train this muscle in the gym. So now that we got the basic anatomy out of the way, again, there are 2 major portions, the back half and the front half, and they all attach to the sort of side of the arm a little bit more toward the back. Let's look at how this muscle can fully stretch and fully shorten, and then we'll transition into understanding how we can actually apply this information directly to the gym when we have to now interact with resistance in the external world. All right, everyone, so if you haven't met Frank, here is my skeleton friend. When we think about the rear delt, again, we have that back portion and that kind of side portion or that front portion. I'll try to use more side language now, honestly. It seems kind of like it's a better idea to me. But anyway, when we're talking about, okay, how do we fully stretch and fully contract this muscle, we just need to work backward from the anatomy that we already understand. So just talking about the back half first, we imagine those fibers are kind of splaying out in this direction down onto that back side of the upper arm. How would we fully stretch that? Well, what we would do is we would want to take point A and point B and move them as far away from one another as possible. And the way that I like to think about this is imagine these fibers are running at this angle. So the rear delt is kind of splaying down and almost underneath of this joint right here. If I want to fully stretch this, what I would want to do is I would want to take these fibers and make them parallel to the bone, right? So these fibers right here are kind of now parallel to the bone, whereas when they're here, they're kind of bridging along the scap. So I want to take the arm up a little bit, and then from this position, I basically just want to wrap the arm, boom, around the body, right? So this is your typical or quintessential reverse fly looking thing. And that's how we're gonna really maximize the stretch on these portions of the rear delt, on the back portions of the rear delt. And then to fully contract them, we're just gonna kind of reverse engineer from that position and bring those 2 points as close together as possible, right? So this is just the end portion of a row where you're really squeezing upward and backward. You're bringing this portion as close to this portion as humanly possible in whatever degree of arm rotation, which we'll talk about in the advanced anatomy section later, that is comfortable. So that's kind of the rear portion of the rear delt. And when we think about how would we really extrapolate this kind of idea, this concept of stretch and contraction to the one that's more on the side? Well, for a second, just think about what you would need to do to stretch the middle delt. The middle delt just branches again from this little slip straight down to the side. And so this thing is fully stretched when you're just squeezing your arm into your body. That's all that you can do to really stretch the middle delt. But the rear delt, what you can see on me is this is kind of that front portion of the rear delt that bridges out right here. All you would need to do, again, is apply that same logic of make the fibers parallel to this bone and then sweep it across. And so what that would look like is, again, for these fibers right here, I would want to take the arm slightly in front of the body and then across the body. So when we're trying to stretch this guy right here, boom, right, just imagine my hand are the fibers, bring the arm slightly forward, right, and then across the body. That's how you're really going to get a really, really good stretch on those guys. You could also call this the back half of the middle delt. I don't really care, okay? I just wanted to include it in the rear delt video because I think that this a lot of times is what people mean by rear delt, is that stuff, okay? Cool, so back half, front half. Back half, we fully stretch by something that's more horizontal, that kind of can come sort of at this angle upward and across, and we'll talk about why sort of more upward and across in the resistance training section. And then to target this portion more specifically, we would want to take the arm kind of lower and across and be raising somewhere upward and outward, almost with something that looks kind of more like a Y raise type motion. So now that we again understand the functional anatomy, let's dive into the resistance training, i.e. how we're now going to apply force and physics from the external world to this internal anatomy. So when we're thinking about training the rear delts in the gym, we really want to think principally in terms of the forces, okay? And the way that I like to think about rear delts is we need some kind of force that is going to pull the arm in really one of two directions. Number one is across the body and kind of forward, and that kind of encapsulates, you know, stretching the arm this way for the more back half of the rear delt and kind of stretching the arm this way for that side portion of the rear delt. And then also sometimes up. And so we're going to talk about that kind of application in the later section on the more advanced anatomy when we start to talk about arm rotation and shoulder rotation and how that will play a role in the recruitment. But let's now go into the gym and let's talk about these different applications and how we would actually best load these motions. Okay, so starting with that horizontal portion of the rear delts. First things first, when you're getting set up, we're going to start with a single arm variation here just to sort of demonstrate the principles. Basically just take your biceps and reach across your face, right? Take your biceps and maybe aim for your mouth chin. And then just be like, oh, where does my hand end up? Okay, for me, that's around here. So I'm just gonna move the cable up. Once I'm in that position, I prefer to use a D handle, and I actually like to just put my hand through the webbing so I don't have to grab it. The first thing I'm going to do, plant my opposite hand. It could be here, it could be anywhere, just so I'm stable, right? And then, again, just reverse engineer from that position that you already had, start to do the reverse fly. Now, when we're loading this motion, we have several things to consider. The first is that we could turn our chest kind of away from the cable like this, which would be more of a stretch focus, right? Because my arm is fully stretched and the loading is heavier here because the cable is pointing backward. Or we could face more toward the cable and kind of pull more like this, right? So this is less of a stretch focus, more of a squeeze focus, which is also perfectly fine. You could do either variation, see which one that you like more. I personally think that there's a place for both, depending on sort of how you organize your program, okay? So for the more horizontal portion, boom, we're here, grab the handle, place the hand. You could just start by maybe being like cable parallel to torso position, and then just see how this feels. Play around with, oh, okay, do I like the turn more? Do I like the turn less? No right or wrong answer necessarily. Now, with that said, if we want to shift things more from the back to the side, what we would do is, again, find that sort of functional anatomy position we talked about earlier, bring the hand kind of down and across, almost like you would be about to grab your opposite side butt cheek. That's how I like to think about it. So opposite side butt cheek, boom, now you have position where the cable should go. And again, same thing here, I like to use the webbing. I like to wrap this around my wrist. Same thing in terms of stability, plant the opposite hand, and then same concept with turning in and away from. Now with this particular variation, I would recommend just a little bit more of a turn. Tends to feel a little bit better just to kind of start with that tension there. Some people with the variation here tend to not feel super great and stable in this position. It's a little bit more of a difficult position to get used to, but again, much like the other one, personal preference here is key, so pay attention to that. So same thing, I'm just gonna kind of lean and turn into the cable. Boom, I've got that full stretch and full lengthened loading. This cable is 90 degrees, which means it's heaviest in this position, just like the other one we were just looking at. And then from there, the motion is this. So what you will notice with both of these executions, number one and number two, is I'm not really trying to get super far behind my body. The reason I'm not trying to get super far behind my body is because that's when other things are really going to start to move. In this case, it's the shoulder blade moving backward, which is not controlled by the rear delts, but rather the rhomboids and the traps. So for this guy right here, I recommend stopping roughly in line with the body. For this guy right here, I recommend stopping just shy of in line with the body. But that will also depend on sort of what range of motion is more comfortable for you. So play around with that and you'll get a good feel for like, oh, this is more rear delt or oh, this is more traps. Okay, cool. So when you're doing the single arm variation with this more side portion of rear delt thing, you can play around with going a little bit lower or a little bit higher. You'll kind of get a sense of what makes you feel the back half more, but anything kind of in this window, you will get a good sense of in terms of what you feel more kind of on the side or more on the back. Now, if we're thinking about doing these motions with two arms, the first thing I would say is that if you're going to do this rear delt fly, two arms at the same time, I would probably take the handles off and basically just set either side of this cable column up around the same height. Extend the arms forward, and guess what? You're just taking the same exact principles that you just went over. Now, in order to change the angle slightly high to low, what I like to do is hinge over a little bit, right? Because hinging over is what's going to make it high to low. And again, the principle of don't go too far back behind the body is probably advisable just to start. You want to think about this kind of just purely as an inward to outward motion. And again, I have that slight hinge so that I can get that slight downward angle as I go through this. Now, the advantage of the two-arm thing is that it's two-arm, but the disadvantage is that it's two-arm. So what that means is that, yeah, maybe you could get your workout done a little bit faster, especially if you're supersetting this exercise, but the downside is that you can't actually get your arm across your body. So if rear delts are a high priority, I would highly recommend the single arm variation to prioritize the stretch because it's something that isn't really covered with other exercises. But if you feel like you love the two arm variation, you have no problems with it, feels like just perfect for you in terms of that angle, two arms just maybe even feels better than one, then perfect, that's fine as well. Now, full disclosure, I don't really do this raising one pretty much ever with two arms. I mean, it just gets really clunky trying to angle the cables backward and behind you. So that one personally, I will admit, is really purely a single arm variation for me, but you could modify the exercise just a little bit and the angle just a little bit to accomplish something similar. So for example, rather than getting the arm all the way across, what we could do is set both cables around the height of the waist. So I'm going to set waist height there, waist height here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the balls of the cables kind of like I did before, except this time I'm going to do it thumbs up. And the way that I would do this guy is I would just lean slightly forward and kind of go straight out to the side, right? So you can make this work two arms at the same time for sure. I just don't love this whole mumbo jumbo that's kind of happening with my hands in this position. Doesn't feel great, it feels a little bit clunky for me, and the arm paths can't be kind of identical as you would want them. So that's why I prefer the single arm raise for the side portion of the rear delt. But if you have access to a machine where you can, do a lateral raise where you're kind of just leaning forward a little bit, right? Again, the lean concept is basically just a different way to get your arm in front of your body so that you can raise kind of outward to the side like so. So if we're gonna do some kind of exercise for the back side of the rear delt with free weights, dumbbells, could you simply just lean over and do the kind of traditional reverse fly? Yes, I don't absolutely love that motion just because of the fact that it tends to be really, really hard here, which is where your traps tend to be taking over. So a simple alternative that you can do in order to basically just mimic that cable exercise is to set a bench on a kind of low incline and basically just do the same exercise where you're just reaching across your body. This will feel a little bit awkward, I think, at first for a lot of you, but all it really is just you taking the dumbbell, reaching it up and across toward your opposite side ear so that you can actually load that fully stretched position. You obviously can't do this with two dumbbells at the same time. If that is just a pain in the ass to you or it just feels uncomfortable, you can't make it work, you can simply just lean all the way over and do a kind of reverse fly like that. That'll be great still for the back half of the rear delt. Now the front half of the rear delt, again, same concept. We're trying to just think in terms of principles here. We can set a bench angle higher, lean sideways on the bench, and then do something that kind of looks like this, right? And again, play around with the angles. Does it feel better to go over here, right? Does it feel better to maybe go kind of more sweeping out to the side? As a starting point recommendation, I would try to mimic what we went over with the cable, where you're kind of reaching toward your opposite side butt cheek, and then you're raising upward and outward this way. So those are two very similar ways to kind of mimic what we went over with the single arm cables. And obviously with the rear delt reverse flies, you can do that. You could also simply, for the sort of back half of the rear delt, just lean slightly forward, not as far forward, right? And just raise that to the side like so with two dumbbells at the same time. Who would have thought a traditional dumbbell lateral raise could make it into this video? I certainly didn't, but here we are. So anyway, if you're gonna do a lateral raise, whether it's with a dumbbell or a machine, as opposed to a cable, the principle would just be like, okay, if this is the resistance, you lean slightly forward, maybe a little bit of sort of pinky out to the side, raising up and out like that. That'll be great for pretty much all of the rear delt, but in particular more that side portion, right? This is just basically another way, as I mentioned earlier, to lean forward, get your arms slightly in front of your body, and raise outward like that. I would personally recommend doing that with two arms, but if you wanted to, you could do it with one as well. So now for the advanced anatomy section, I've been mentioning a bunch different times, and I've sort of alluded to it in the training sections, that there's a little bit more to the picture here when it comes to the anatomy and specifically upper arm rotation. Why does upper arm rotation matter? Well, let's talk about that now. So Frank did us a favor in the earlier sections, but I want to kind of just move him aside because I think you all get the general picture of how we need to move and focus a little bit more on just these two bones right here. And I'm going to represent my rear delt with this green little thing here. So this is going to represent the attachment site. This is very, very important. When we talk about shoulder rotation, really what we're talking about is internal and external rotation. Those are the motions I just demonstrated. On me, my right arm, internal rotation is this. External rotation is this, okay? If I have my arm straight, internal rotation, external rotation, okay? And so why does internal and external rotation matter a whole lot? Well, specifically because of the fact that when I change rotational positions of on my upper arm, the rear delt insertion will move, okay? So if this is the kind of normal insertion, I'm just gonna hold my thumb here and I'm gonna pick a middle ground of where to put those fibers. Me rotating my upper arm will change the relationship between the insertion and where the sort of muscle is pulling, okay? So if I really internally rotate my arm, you'll see how this insertion, watch my thumb, it's gonna move more to the side of the body and more toward the front of the body. Whereas if I rotate my arm this way, which would be external rotation, what will happen is my thumb will move backward, okay? And so really where this insertion is gonna point is where the upper arm is gonna be pulled by the rear delt. So let's think about it this way. If I do a lateral raise, right, raise out to the side, and I internally rotate my arm like this, right? So watch what happens. So here's me from the side, Ben is standing like this, here's me, right? If I internally rotate my arm and then I raise, do you all see how the rear delt now is actually going to have some ability to start to pull upward and outward, right? Specifically because of the fact if we look at the fibers that sit kind of like here and they wrap more around, because of the fact that I am now, if I can get this to stay, let me just do this right here. Sorry about this, guys and girls. If I can imagine the fibers are kind of running around the top here. If I internally rotate my upper arm, right, this insertion point is going to now move in the outward direction that I'm actually raising, right? Whereas if I externally rotate, you'll see how that external rotation will put the rear delt more on the back. So just think about it this way. If I rotate my arm externally, like I'm turning my palm to you all the camera, okay, my whole arm, biceps to the ceiling, and I raise out to the side, that will basically shift my rear delt from where it was on the side to the back. So now my rear delt, if I externally rotate, it's gonna wanna pull more in that backward direction. Just do this for yourself as you're watching. Externally rotate and then pull back. You'll feel all that stuff happening in your rear delt, right? But now what happens if I turn everything down, just go elbow, crook of the elbow to the sky, really over exaggerate it, and then raise up and out to the side. What you will find, you'll get stopped a little bit earlier, but you'll find that now what happens is you've rolled the rear delt toward the side of the body effectively, in terms of the relative position of how you're raising. And then once you raise from that position, your rear delt is doing a shit ton of work, okay? Whereas if you find a middle ground, right, just middle delt all day. And so the key thing to remember here is that rotation of the arm is really going to dictate the sort of map of the territory of where the rear delt is going to be able to pull. Again, if you're doing a side lateral raise and you rotate really internally, this sort of side portion of the rear delt is going to be able to do a lot of work, right? This portion back here, not so much because it's going to be sitting below this axis of the joint. But the point just being, when you internally rotate and pull out to the side, a lot of rear delt. When you externally rotate and you pull out to the side, minimal, if any, rear delt whatsoever. Now let's think about how this applies to rows and to pull downs, right? Because I mentioned earlier that we have this situation where when we're doing some kind of pulling motion, right, the rear delt may or may not be involved in certain cases where like we have a resistance that's pulling the arm upward, right? And this all has to do with this rotation thing. So imagine you're doing a pull down motion, okay? And we'll compare that or contrast that with a pull over motion. If I'm doing a pull down motion, whether it's here or whether it's here, my arm is in a relatively externally rotated position. You all see that, right? So here's me rotating my arm, right? This is internal rotation, this is external rotation. If my arm is in external rotation and I'm doing a pull down here, I'm doing a pull down here, is the rear delt able to pull down? Well, the answer is dependent on the arm rotation. In this case, yes, right? Because imagine, here's my upper arm, I go forward now. Okay, this is going to be a little bit harder to depict, but hopefully you all get it, get the point here. Just imagine these fibers are kind of running like this. My upper arm is here, and I externally rotate, right? What's going to happen is this rear delt is going to sit below the joint axis like this. Again, the insertion is over here, but you know, here's my band. You all will get the point. If I externally rotate like this, the rear delt sits below this joint, which means that it can pull the arm downward, right? And if my arm is out here and I externally rotate, right, the rear delt is below this joint axis. Again, it's really up here, so it can pull downward like this. But what now happens if I were to internally rotate, okay? So if I do pull downs here, rear delts, they are going to be movers, probably secondary or after the lats, right? The lats are going to be the main sort of pull down muscles because of how much your shoulder girdle is involved, but that's maybe a topic for another video. But when I'm doing a pull down here or here, I'm in external rotation, I got some rear delts involved. But what happens if I'm doing, let's say, like a pullover motion? Because in a pullover motion, right, my arm is relatively internally rotated. Imagine I'm grabbing some kind of bar and I'm shoving it down like this. Well, why would the rear delts not be involved in a pullover that's like this or a pullover that's like this? Well, because of what's happening to this rotation, okay? Let's revisit it. So if I'm in external rotation, rear delt below the joint, it can pull down, cool. But if I move relatively into internal rotation, I'm just gonna not try to hold this anymore because it's probably harming the understanding here more than helping. If I internally rotate my arm, right, and I move forward, where did the insertion move, right? So internal rotation moves the insertion more kind of towards the top side of the joint like this. And if this muscle is now on the top side of this joint like this, well, now no longer has an ability to pull downward, right? Because it's literally on the top side of the joint. So think about this from just a simpler, more concrete perspective. If I internally rotate, ask yourself the question, where would my rear delt want to pull me if my arm is in this position? Well, think about what we were talking about earlier with reverse flies. Because it's now on the side, it would want to pull outward like this, right? This is the position that people do reverse flies in, right? Because if I were to, do a pull down like this, right? What I would be doing is I would be moving this attachment site underneath, because it's underneath, it can pull down, right? So this is why when you do rows and you're training your rear delt with a row, you put your arm like this, because if you're in this position, the rear delt pulls this way, it does not pull this way. And likewise, if your arm is all the way out here, if you're doing a pullover motion from the side, the same is true. So if my arm is in this position, my rear delt wants to pull me backward, right? My lats and my teres major, they want to pull me downward, okay? And this all really comes back to, where is this insertion point moving when I rotate the arm? So in simple terms, I'll try to simplify the advanced section here. Rotation of the arm is going to set the trajectory of the rear delt muscle. In any position that you're in, ask yourself, in what position is the arm rotated? Because that will be your guide as to whether or not the rear delt is involved. In the example we used, if my arm is externally rotated, then my rear delt is under the joint, so it can pull down, right? But if my arm is now internally rotated, I'm doing a pullover motion, my rear delt is kind of on the side of the joint, and so in this position, it would want to pull outward like this. It would not pull downward like this. And so when you're asking yourself how much or how little is the rear delt involved, well, that is entirely dependent on the joint position and how the joint position relates to the resistance demands. All right, so last but certainly not least, how do we sort of go about programming for the rear delts? Well, this is what I like to do. I like to pick one movement for each part of the rear delt. Remember, we went over the side part of the rear delt and the back part of the rear delt. So on my day one, what I will do is some kind of reverse fly for that back portion of the rear delt. Again, when we're considering the reverse fly, remember how we talked about loading more in the stretched position, right? Getting that single arm across the body rather than doing some kind of row, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then on my day two, I do that Y raise thing that I was telling you about in terms of targeting more of the side portion of the rear delt. When we're thinking about sort of accessory volume, which I'll put in quotations, remember how I mentioned the lats are a huge mover in pull downs and rows, right? We need to remember the fact that the rear delts, depending on the joint position and any row and pull down, are still getting some accessory volume. So for me, that concept of the short position stuff that we talked about earlier is really relevant here, because when we're doing pull downs and rows, that's really only challenging the rear delt in its shortest muscle length, which is why on day one here, I really have a reverse fly, a stretch focused reverse fly for me personally. And I count this other stuff, this short position stuff, as accessory, because when I do rows, I perform, depending on how you count different motions for different muscle groups, on a given week, I'll perform, maybe 12 sets, 10 to 12 sets of rows and pull downs combined over the course of a week, which depending on how you count that volume, maybe you count it as half a set per exercise for rear delts. And if you want to do that, that's a total of maybe, we're counting 3 sets on this day, 3 sets on this day, with a total of 6 over here. Like, that's a lot of volume for the rear delts. It's like 12 sets throughout the week. Not that this is relevant for this particular video, but I like to train everything to failure, right? So I'm doing hard sets for the rear delts. I'm doing more than 10 per week, which may be different for you. You just have to kind of experiment to see what works for you. So I consider these two sort of primary exercises, again, that Y raise type thing as one for more of the side portion of the rear delt, and then the reverse fly as my sort of go-to for the back portion of the rear delt. I should mention that, of course, you could do, the 2-arm variation if you wanted to, either for the Y raise or the reverse fly. I just prefer the single arm because you can make the loading more specific, and you can basically just make the motion a little bit more comfortable for either side if you have differences on either side. So for me personally, speaking, sort of connecting all the dots with the arm rotation stuff, my right shoulder likes to be a little bit more internally rotated compared to this one, whether that's just because of the anatomy and how I, grew up, throwing right-handed, for example, batting right-handed, throwing right-handed, all those things, for me, may have shaped my anatomy as a kid differently than you. And so just consider the fact that you may want to actually, make those sorts of minor adjustments to either side, and to be able to do so is really only possible in something like a single arm variation for our intents and purposes. So overall, I hope this video was helpful to you. I hoped that it was clear and concise in the ways that are important to you. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, just know that this is all kind of really just scratching the surface. I tried to explain everything relatively simply and quickly, but my online courses and ebooks go into much more detail about this stuff. So I will put a link below where you can explore all the different biomechanics related products I have. I even have a new membership that you're able to join now if you want to work one-on-one with me personally. So check that out. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give me your feedback in the comment section on this video where I can maybe be more clear and make follow-up videos, or maybe you want to see these kinds of videos for other muscle groups. So thank you very much for watching if you still are, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.